There are some topics that we've been meaning to cover almost since we first launched the channel back in 2019, but for whatever reason, we just kept putting to the side and saying we'd come back to them. I am very happy to say that we are getting to one of those topics today, one that might feel secondary in the Cold War time period, but whose impact on the course of Cold War events plays a rather outsized role, especially as the process of decolonization speeds up. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at Portugal under Salazar and up to the period of the 1974 Carnation Revolution. This is the Cold War. The period between the end of the Second World War and the Carnation Revolution in Portugal marked a significant chapter in the country's history. During this time, Portugal faced numerous challenges, both domestically and internationally, as it sought to navigate the complexities of post-war recovery and maintain its colonial empire. But before we delve into this period, we will need to backtrack a bit to the end of the First Republic and the beginning of Salazar's regime. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar came to power in 1932 after the national dictatorship that had been established 6 years earlier following the coup d'etat of the 28th of May 1926 had stabilized Portugal, who had suffered from political instability during the years of the First Republic. In 1933, Salazar reshaped the Ditadura Nacional into the Estado Novo, forming what could essentially be a new Portuguese state, based heavily on corporatism, nationalism, and Catholicism. Pivotal for the regime was also the adoption of Lusotropicalism as a state philosophy. A key feature of this theory was that the Portuguese, owing to their warmer climate and long history of multiculturalism, made them more humane colonizers. This then contributed to the view that Angola, Mozambique, and other Portuguese territories were extensions of Portugal itself, thereby perpetuating the overseas empire as necessary for the continuation of the existence of Portugal. Salazar's belief that Portugal could not possibly exist if she lost her territories, that in some cases she had controlled since the 15th century, would cause Portugal to face serious backlash from the international community during the Cold War waves of decolonization. Portugal, despite its centuries-long alliance with Great Britain, remained officially neutral during the Second World War, a strategic maneuver designed to not push Franco's Spain fully into the Axis camp. Despite this, Salazar still provided subtle assistance to the Allies throughout the 6 years of the European conflict. But staying out of the war didn't mean that Portugal wouldn't feel its impacts, or that it could continue on its own course unimpeded during the new order brought by the Cold War. Now, despite Portugal's neutrality during the war, their economy was significantly affected due to economic dislocations across Europe and around the world. The government in Lisbon became focused on not only reconstruction, but the industrialization of the economy with an emphasis on self-sufficiency. Portugal's pre-Salazar economy had reached a world record low, but Salazar helped to bring monetary stability and even created some budgetary surpluses. These, however, did come at the cost of exploiting the poor peasantry, and naturally, this included not only the peasantry of mainland Portugal, but also of the overseas territories of Angola and Mozambique as well. Important to point out here also is a significant side effect of the Great Depression in Portugal. They were unable to afford American cotton. As a result, it turned to colonial cotton, despite objections from textile mills who claimed it was of lower quality as well as being more expensive. The peasants in the African colonies also protested, as cotton cultivation provided a poorer subsistence compared to growing food crops. Nonetheless, the state forced farmers in Angola and Mozambique to grow cotton, shifting the risk of failed crops and lower outputs onto the black peasantry, which eventually led to a political confrontation. As you can imagine, this forced shift had a catastrophic outcome as famine broke out in Angola in 1945, which subsequently led to a rebellion. Yet, despite having fairly accurate insights of the causes of this famine by way of their colonial officers, the Portuguese government in Lisbon opted to dismiss it as fabrication and continued with the same set of policies. This, inevitably, led to another famine in 1961. This famine would serve as fuel for the rebellion that would break out 2 years later and would drag Portugal into a 13-year-long colonial war that would ultimately lead to the empire's destruction. But back in the 1950s, Portugal was experiencing an economic growth rate that would skyrocket over the following decade. While the small growth rates of the 1940s and 1950s was not enough to lift Portugal from the poverty into which it had sunk, by the late 1950s and especially the early 1960s, conditions had matured enough to allow the almost unprecedented economic development of the nation. Industrialists, government technocrats, and members of Salazar's cabinet looked to the more powerful economies of the north with which to trade and secure investments. In 1960, Portugal became one of the founding members of the European Free Trade Association, a major trade bloc that rivaled the European Economic Community, the predecessor to the European Union. The following year, Portugal continued to extend its economic integration with the rest of the world by becoming a member of the World Bank, the IMF, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. These revived economic relations with the rest of the world also brought some liberalization in industry, and the Portuguese government allowed the creation of many privately owned factories that focused on the production of steel, plastics, electronics, vehicle parts, food and beverages, and shipbuilding. The shared free market economy with other European states, the foreign investments, and the gastarbeiters, foreign workers that were returning from Central Europe with a small fortune, all contribute to Portugal's economic miracle. So, despite having to fight an expensive overseas war in Angola and Mozambique, the state managed to achieve a phenomenal annual growth rate of 6.9% for GDP and 9% for industrial production. Even if the war was a costly affair, it was in Portugal's best economic interests to not just abandon its overseas territories. In 1954, deep-sea oil was discovered just north of Angola in the Cabinda enclave. While it was mostly foreign capital that benefited from the exploitation of the oil reserve, the share the Portuguese state enjoyed was not negligible, to say the least. But besides the black gold, there were other resources worth fighting for. Wine, textiles, and especially coffee were in high demand and had formed a lucrative market, and the economies of Angola and Mozambique boomed. Even distant Macau saw its economy revived when, in 1962, the Sociedad de Turismo de Diversios de Macau acquired all gambling rights, turning the port city into the Las Vegas of the East. This economic growth, especially that of mainland Portugal, would continue even after Salazar stepped down from his office in 1968. His successor, Marcelo Caetano, would further lift restrictions regarding industry, though the rate at which the economy would grow would drop following the Carnation Revolution. Now, while Portugal's integration into the world economy, the influx of foreign capital, and the economic exploitation of the wealth of the colonies are the most significant factors that led to Portugal's economic miracle during the 1960s, the effect of the Estado Novo's educational system cannot be underestimated. During its first decade, Salazar's regime established a compulsory 3 years of education and significantly raised the number of primary schools in order to provide this. However, education was also used as an indoctrination tool to help create citizens that would fit the state's motto of Deus, Patria y Familia. The economic growth of the 1950s, however, forced the education system to adapt to the new and changing needs of the population. The revived industries of Europe had a constant demand for skilled workers, so it's no wonder that the number of pupils attending technical schools in Portugal skyrocketed during this period, as the state needed to accommodate training for more technicians. Also indicative of the progress achieved during this decade is the literacy rate among school-aged children, which rose from roughly 81.5% in 1952 to almost 100% by 1960. But on the other hand, it's not like education in Portugal had done a complete 180. The system was still plagued by many shortcomings, according to a 1965 report. For example, Portugal had the shortest compulsory schooling term, even when in 1954 it was extended from 3 to 4 years. Schools also experienced low attendance and even the abandonment of education beyond mandatory schooling, while the countryside suffered from low coverage and teacher shortages. Problems in education extended all the way up to the university level, which often failed to provide adequate qualifications for students, and instead graduates had to secure jobs the old-fashioned way through the old patronage system. This outdated educational practice would soon clash with the rising aspirations and wishes of Portuguese society. The new medium of television and increased international contact began to change the views of the working class and the petty bourgeoisie, who now saw education as a way to climb the social and even political ladder. An interesting side note about television in Portugal is that from the mid-1960s, it was also employed as an educational tool, hosting an instructional program created by the Portuguese public broadcasting organization called Telescola, whose purpose was to reach isolated rural areas that had no school facilities. So, this new outlook on education by the lower classes and the radicalization of certain sectors of society caused by the colonial war started in 1960, soon clashed with the older ideological orientation of education, and ultimately led to the Simão reform of the early 1970s. Veiga Simão, a former rector of the recently established University of Lourenço Marques in Mozambique, became Minister of Education in 1971 and proposed a rather radical democratization and expansion of the Portuguese education system. The reforms included the increase of mandatory schooling from 6 to 8 years, plus 2 years of preschool education, the inclusion of polytechnic institutes into the highest levels of education, and better training for school teachers through university-led training schools. Simão's reforms were nothing short of groundbreaking for the Estado Novo, as they constituted a major shift in the philosophy of the country's educational system. Under Salazar, school was dogmatic and served only to teach someone his place in life, but now it served the purpose of creating a skilled and educated workforce that would further develop the economy. It offered equal opportunity to the popular masses, and more importantly, it provided a way for entry into state politics. The Simão reform in itself, however, was not enough, and it can be argued that instead it only served to highlight the outdated corporatist model of the Estado Novo, furthering the gap between the ruling class and the people and leading to the revolution of April 25, 1974, known widely as the Carnation Revolution. The military coup that brought down Caetano's government and the Estado Novo was not the product of a single night. The conditions that led to it had been present in Portuguese society for more than a decade. While Salazar tried tooth and nail to hold his colonial empire together, he was fighting a lost cause as the winds of time were blowing in the opposite direction, that of decolonization. But for the Portuguese government of the time, holding on to their overseas territories wasn't just a matter of economic exploitation, but also a matter of national pride. Despite this desire, however, it was becoming increasingly difficult to hold on to the colonies. In the cases of the Portuguese enclaves on the Indian subcontinent, it wasn't just difficult, it was downright impossible. Faced with an overwhelming force, the Portuguese first relinquished the territories of Dadra and Nagar Haveli in 1954 and those of Goa Daman and Diu in 1961. The latter even brought about a direct armed confrontation between the Indian armed forces and the Portuguese garrisons, as Salazar was not willing to just give them up. Unsurprisingly, the short-lived conflict resulted in a crushing defeat for Portugal, who, in a show of defiance, refused to acknowledge Indian sovereignty over the territories. A few weeks later, on the 3rd of January 1962, Salazar would declare at the National Assembly that the ceding of national territory was not negotiable. The Portuguese government would even call for armed resistance of the Goan people against the Indian invaders and instigated a series of bombings in Goa. It wasn't until 1974 and the end of the Salazar regime that Portugal would resume diplomatic relations with India and would sign a treaty recognizing Indian sovereignty over the former Portuguese possessions. Salazar was in a similar predicament in the Far East as well, regarding the city of Macau. Beijing was openly questioning the port city's territorial status, having declared the Lisbon Protocol of 1887 to be unfair and illegitimate. A series of events, including a skirmish between Portuguese and Chinese troops in 1952, as well as a violent clash between Maoists and Macau's police forces during the 12-3 incident in 1966, ultimately forced the Portuguese government to sign a humiliating agreement that effectively transferred suzerainty of Macau to Beijing authorities. The official transfer wouldn't happen until 1999, as China was satisfied with the status quo. Mao stated that Taiwan was his priority and China would not pursue anything else in the city, but ironically, he did support independence movements in the other Portuguese possessions. Yet the blows dealt to Portugal's colonial empire by losing these enclaves would pale in comparison to the independence movements that arose in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea, and would plunge the country into a decade-long colonial conflict. Contrary to the situation in India and the Far East, Lisbon was of the opinion that the threat to its African possessions could be dealt with militarily, with special forces proving to be extremely valuable thanks to their training in asymmetric warfare. The war, while not as costly as other contemporary conflicts in terms of human losses, was still draining a large portion of the country's GDP, but more importantly, it diplomatically isolated the country from the rest of the world. Portugal had to face both the Soviet Union and the rest of the Eastern Bloc, who were providing all kinds of support to the guerrillas. Additionally, Lisbon also had to face criticism from its own NATO ally, the United States, who looked to remove imperial powers from Africa, possibly so they could bring those areas into their own sphere of influence. A deep anti-war sentiment in Portugal was born, which slowly spread among the populace and left many young men to flee the country to escape conscription. In the end, it permeated even the ranks of the military, and a group of left-wing officers created the Armed Forces movement. The straw that broke the camel's back and pushed the officers into action seems to have been, in fact, a military law passed by Caetano's administration that would bring equality between militia officers and those who had graduated from the prestigious military school. This loss of respect and distinction was too much. In the early morning hours of the 25th of April, 1974, the MFA mobilized the army, but they soon were joined by thousands of civilians who turned what was originally planned as a military coup into a popular revolution nicknamed the Carnation Revolution. Caetano was forced to surrender power, and he fled to Brazil. After 41 years, Salazar's regime, the longest enduring dictatorship in the history of Europe, the Estado Novo, was no more, and a new chapter in Portuguese history was about to begin. But that is for a future episode. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss any of our future episodes, be sure to like and subscribe, and make sure you set aside 3 hours in the afternoon so your bell button can learn its schoolwork from Telescola, maybe with a nice corrida. A nice thank you to all our Patreon patrons who help to make this show possible, and if you aren't already, please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.